It's a privilege and a pleasure for me to introduce Natalie this evening. I've been chatting with her. You are in for a treat. She has spent her entire working life within the realm of the performing arts. She's the director of the University of Vermont Lane series, a position she's held since 2012. Prior to being named director, she managed the series for 16 years. She holds a BFA in acting and directing from Montclair State University and an MFA in directing for stage from Pennsylvania State University. In addition to all of that, she also finds time as a UVM faculty member teaching in diverse areas such as arts management, aesthetics of live performance, Jewish studies, and the arts of the Weimar period. So thank you very much for coming. And here's Natalie.
Thank you. So about 3 years ago, just pre-COVID, the College of Arts and Sciences put out a call for courses for Jewish studies, which they were developing, and they offered some funding to develop a course. And for a long time, I've thought it would be interesting to teach in that area. And food is sort of my passion. Arts is my living and my passion, but food interests me, and it interests me in some ways the same way music and language interests me, because it's the thing we carry, right? So I developed this class, the Jewish Diaspora in 20 Dishes. I taught it in, ready? I taught it in spring of 2020. I basically taught it for the month of February. And then we went home and we sort of figured out a way to keep things going, and actually I think the students got a lot out of it. So here we go. This quote from Joan Nathan is great. I bet there are some Jewish people in the hall, but for those of you that aren't Jewish, haroseth is a festival food we eat during Passover. It's basically fruit, nuts, wine, chopped and served. It has a representation of the mortar of the temple, and the quote refers to the fact that it can be any fruit, any nuts, any wine, and if you're from, for example, Italy, those fruit and nuts, or Spain would be different than how most of us grew up in the United States with apples and walnuts. These are just some quotes from some songs. The first one from Vampire Weekend, which sort of is an interesting one because it shows the voyages in reverse, maybe. This one is particularly moving to me because it applies to the Ukrainian people right now. It certainly applied to Jews throughout history. But we're a traveling folk. So my research started with the question, can food tell the story of the Jewish diaspora? If you try to tell the story of the wandering Jew through food, it has these elements. These are sort of the key elements. Kashrut, or kosher laws. So the rules of kosher eating take precedence over everything, even when those rules aren't followed. So I grew up in a non-kosher home, but in a million years, my mother would not have put sausage or bacon in a bowl of lentil soup. In a million years, milk would not have been served at the table. We were not kosher, but those rules went deep. And even to this day, like, milk, that's for a brownie, that's it. Holiday foods versus everyday foods. In Jewish cooking and eating, these are really important. It's true in almost every culture. The eating of certain foods at certain holidays or festivals because they're a reminder, like an edible mnemonic. So what are some Jewish foods we might eat at certain times of year? What about at Hanukkah? What's the big one? Latkes, oily foods, right? To celebrate the oil that lasted, the miracle of the lights. Certainly all the Passover, many of the Passover foods would go into that category. And then region, climate, food availability and affordability, and local traditions and local methods. So in most ways, Jewish food of a certain region is the same as the food that non-Jews would have eaten in those regions, with the laws of kashrut and the holiday traditions laid on top of them. So, you know, if you go to Morocco and you have, Morocco's maybe a bad example because they would mostly be living by halal rules, which are similar to kosher rules. If you go to Italy, you might have a dish that Jews would eat, like a tomato sauce on pasta, but the Jewish version would never have the sausage, etc. And we'll look at an interesting Italian food actually later in the talk. Also remember, Jews have a weekly holiday, and it's arguably the most important holiday we have, in which food is a major part, and that's Shabbat, and it happens every Friday night. So I think that's in some ways unique. Like there is the Christian Sabbath, and it is on a Sunday, and you worship on that day, so it's the same thing, right? It's just for Jews, it's a holiday. And for families that, you know, maybe were not wealthy, did not have, you know, a variety of foods in their diet because of poverty, there was a chicken on the table on Friday night. An effort was always made. So there are three divisions that only partly tell the story of Jewish foodways around the world. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and then these two kind of come together, Mizrahi, Middle Eastern, grouped with Maghrebi, North African. So as the wandering Jews wandered, women brought their recipes. And when they moved and settled or were exiled, they encountered new climates, new ingredients. They encountered local people of different faiths, local recipes. They ran into local different market schedules. So in North African Jewish cooking, there's a dish that's Tuesday couscous, and it's vegetarian. It's vegetables. My guess is that's because Tuesday was market day, or Wednesday was market day, and you needed to use them up on Tuesday. And they, of course, were affected by their new status as immigrants, and therefore perhaps a different economic structure. So the food changed. So we'll start with the Ashkenazi and the Pale of Settlement. So most of us in America are Ashkenazi Jews. I think I have a slide that gives the statistics. It's like 80%. Is there anyone in this room who's a Sephardic Jew, for example? We are Ashkenazi. You could take a room of 80 American Jews and there would be one person who is not an Ashkenazi Jew. And that has to do with migratory patterns, which we'll look at. So the Ashkenazi were Eastern European Jews who lived in a big circle, a giant circle, that took in these countries: Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, pretty much all of Ukraine, Moldova is interesting, and Russia to that side, which my slide is over. It was the area which, by Tsarist decree, all Jews were permitted permanent settlement. It ran from 1792 to 1917. It didn't offer safety to Jews, but it effectively segregated them. It was designed to keep Jewish merchants from not competing with non-Jewish merchants in big cities. And even within the Pale, there were places that Jews couldn't live. Big cities like Kyiv and Sebastopol, no Jews allowed. Big cities within the Pale where Jews could live included Minsk, Riga, Vitebsk, and Vilna. My family was from Vitebsk, which is in Belarus. There were also many Ashkenazi Jews living in areas like Romania and Hungary, but it was beyond the influence of the Tsars. And the term that Jews gave to those places were that they were beyond the Pale. So when we use that expression, that's something that's beyond the Pale, that's where it comes from. It has nothing to do with color or shade. So what makes an Ashkenazi an Ashkenazi? So the majority of Jews today, 80%, and certainly American Jews who left the Pale and Eastern Europe in large numbers for America starting in 1905. If you're Jewish, if you're American, if you're Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe, that's when your family most likely came here, from 1905 forward. A diasporic people originally started in the Holy Land. They made their way west through France, Germany, the Rhine Valley, the Rhone Valley. So a lot of the foods that we eat are from that German-French location. Yiddish language is the common thread. That's what they spoke. Very convenient language when you're a traveler, a trader. You can go to a completely different country and the people you are trading with and buying food from speak your language. Maybe a different variety of it, My mother used to say when she would like hear a movie where they spoke Yiddish, she'd be like, oh yeah, that's not my Yiddish. But, you know, you could make yourself understood. Ashkenazi foods tend to be the food we think of when we think of Jewish food because it is common in America. My grandmother, who came from Vitebsk, brought 2 things with her. When she came, actually she brought 4 things. A feather bed, which we don't have anymore because I'm sure it's disgusting if we had it. Russian tea glasses that had the copper, those broke. And then these 2 things, which I'll pass around. This we called the Hachmesser. Messer, like Mackie Messer, knife, chopping. My grandfathers made it. They were metalsmiths. According to my mother, it was twice as big when she was a girl. You know, it just got sharp and smaller and smaller. And this fantastic, beautiful cherry, maybe rolling pin. I'll put these here. If people are, you know, careful with COVID and touching, that's fine. But if people want to see it, that's good.
Oh my gosh. This is like so smooth from
hands. Yeah. You can see the fold where the metal is folded. It's a cool thing. I use it. So the American Ashkenazi diaspora was a response to a particularly vicious series of pogroms between 1903 and 1906. Pogroms meaning attacks on Jewish settlements and communities. And sometimes people in their small villages or shtetls in Eastern Europe within the Pale were given extremely quick notice to vacate, sometimes within 24 hours. That's the story we hear we know from Fiddler on the Roof. You know, it happened fast. Another big reason people left, and this is actually the reason my grandfathers left, was conscription into the army. So could be, as a Jew, you could be called up into the Tsar's army, and children as young as 14, boys, were conscripted. So if you did not want your son to die in some Russian war on some steppe, you left. So most Eastern European Jews ended up in New York City, specifically the Lower East Side, also Brooklyn, but we are everywhere. That is important to know. Rural places, all over the United States. Burlington, Vermont, very early Jewish Lithuanian community. But, you know, we think of that world as a New York world in many ways. So here are the foods we associate with Ashkenazi cuisine. Kugels, which is like a noodle or potato pudding. Stuffed cabbage, stuffed derma, stuffed kishka. Jews are big on stuffed foods, by the way, because it makes the food go longer. You know, you can stretch it. Pastrami and other deli meats. Pickled and smoked and pickled fish. Pickles. Soups, borscht, krupnik. Anybody know what that is? My parents never used that term either, but it's common, it's Polish. Mushroom barley. And chicken soup, of course. Chopped liver, which is what you use the Hachmesser for. Gefilte fish, a kind of, well, the Jews know what it is. A stuffed fish that when you marry a non-Jew, they find horrifying. Mine is in the corner there. Potato latkes, as you mentioned. Some of the sweet things, rugelach, mandelbrot, almond bread, honey cake. Rugelach is a little rolled cookie. You can buy them at, now you can buy them at Costco. You know, they make pretty good ones. Brisket, filling, bland, calorie-dense, cold weather foods. And of course the bagel, you know, the ultimate Jewish food. So many cultures have a bagel, have something like a bagel. I'll show you a picture in a minute. They're easy to transport. They're easy to sell. You can walk around with them on a pole, which is actually how people used to sell them. Easy for a hand, including a child's hand to grip, maybe the perfect child food. You can read this little story about this Polish king who saved the city of Vienna, and they made a bread in his honor that was shaped like a stirrup. That's one story. But I am going to point out this slide, because if you were Jewish, you stick to plain sesame, poppy, and onion. A salt bagel is a pretzel, and a blueberry bagel is a crime. So another story, courtesy of the sort of doyen of American Jewish cooking, and by the way, I brought a few cookbooks if people want to just take a look on their way out. A bagel is not a noodle. So this is a story that was told to Joan Nathan by the bagel family. Yes, there is a bagel family in Poland. They were bakers, they named themselves after the thing they baked because Jews did not have last names until 1821 in Poland. Your name was Sam the tailor, or, you know, Nadia, the wife of Sam the tailor. Those were your names. So Muddle the tailor from Fiddler on the Roof. No last name. So the bagel family were, until the Holocaust, bakers in Krakow. The theory is that Jewish merchants from Krakow traveled to sell their goods. They had to take kosher food with them to eat on the road. And in order to eat bread, they had to wash their hands. And there was a lot of typhus and disease around from the water. You couldn't trust the water. So the washing of hands was risky. So the bagel family decided to boil the dough first. And it took, from a Talmudic point of view, the object, the bagel, from the category of bread, where you had to wash your hands to eat it, into the category of noodle, which you didn't have to wash your hands to do. So it's apocryphal, and God knows if it's true. I mean, it's a bizarre story, really, but it's kind of interesting. And of course, the boiled dough is the distinction of the bagel. It makes the hard crust. Here are some pictures of other bagels around the world. That's Turkey. I know simit is the sort of Turkish version. It's a lot like a bagel. There's an Italian, these are Italian version, this is an Italian version. Yeah, there are other bagels. So I'm gonna not really give you, I'm not gonna necessarily, well, maybe I'll cruise through my recipe quickly. It's on the next page, but brisket is an interesting food. Many Jews grew up with brisket on the holidays, and it encapsulates the American Jewish story in many ways. It is not a cut of meat our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents would have eaten in the Pale of Settlement. It was not in the category of food people ate. It was expensive, even though it was a cheap cut of meat. It was hard to procure, it was hard to get. It wasn't like a chicken that was running around your yard and you could get fresh and cut the head off. It would not have been affordable in the old world. So it's for as Jewish families assimilated in America, brisket became like a symbol, you know, of success. Like, it's a big, big piece of meat, and I don't have to work all day because I can stay home and cook it all day, right? The whole symbol of the brisket we've lost, but it really was there. So I have a recipe. I'm in the process of compiling the recipes from this talk. And I'm going to send them to Renee, and if people want them, she can email them to you.
That'll be a finance next program.
This is my secret brisket recipe. I will tell you that I'm a gourmet, I'm a foodie. I don't do this kind of thing normally. I don't do like dried onion soup, and I don't do ginger ale. The best brisket you ever. I promise you, right, Eddie?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the ginger ale does something, like there's an enzyme in it that breaks the meat down. So let's talk about cholent. Cholent is most likely comes from the original migration to the Rhine and the Rhone valleys. It's likely from Latin to warm via Old French. But it also, you notice, lines up with those two French words, warm and slow, chaud and lent. And it's a long-cooked stew that provided a hot meal on Saturday after Shabbat services. So all branches of Jewry have a tradition of cholent. I did not grow up with it. It had really already gone out of style pretty much. In religious families it was in style because you needed a way to have a hot meal after Shabbat, and you couldn't cook on the Sabbath. So that was a cool picture of a beautiful old cholent pot. So on Friday before sundown, the ingredients were placed in the pot in layers: beans, meat, stuffed derma. In France, they often use goose, a grain like barley, potatoes, eggs go on top, salt and pepper and water. Yeah, this sticks to your ribs. And the cholent pot would be taken to a communal baking oven, often by the young boys in the family on the way to Friday night services. It would be placed in the coals of the communal baking oven, and the coals which would go out because it was Shabbat, and it would sit undisturbed, cooking in the residual heat of the oven. People often put a flour, like a pastry flour lid over the top and carve their initials into it, or your cholent pot might have your family name, so when the kid went back to get it, you would know yours. So a family can enjoy a hot meal without lighting the stove on Shabbat. There's a picture of cholent. Yeah, it's quite the meal. And you know, it's really similar to cassoulet, to the French dish. I mean, it's got the beans, it's got the meats, it's clearly connected to that food. And so I think that cassoulet, that recipe most likely came from Jews into the French vernacular. Of course, French people would use sausage in it. Jews used goose or confit of duck, which actually still is in cassoulet. And the crock pot, here's a trivia, crock pot was invented by a Canadian Jew in order to make cholent. So it was the origin of the crock pot, is as a cholent cooker. It's kind of interesting. Picture of cassoulet, very similar. So chicken soup. Soup is a Jewish food, not really. But it's the perfect food for thrifty stretching of a meal, warming you up in a cold climate. And although it's ubiquitous, we eat it all the time, it does associate with Passover, especially with matzah balls, or Crepe Luck, as we call them. Jews were associated with chicken. Jews raised poultry. It was a common thing the Jews did, raised and sold poultry. Plus you end up with the fat, the schmaltz. And yes, it absolutely cures the common cold. And you should always have some frozen in your freezer. It was hard for me to choose one soup as part of the 20 recipes in my class when I teach this to students. Close runners-up were borscht, the soup that answers the question, why waste the nutrition in the beets, in the water after you've boiled the beets, and krupnik, mushroom barley, which is ultimately the one I included in the class. And I will say that mushrooms are also a food that's associated with Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. So old Russian babushkas went out and collected all sorts of fabulous mushrooms, including ceps or porcini. I mean, everything grew in those Polish woods. And they're, you know, it works very well as a food because it's neither meat nor dairy. A note on the dumplings, Knädel, as in Knädelach, is the word for dumpling in German. And when matzo balls were first marketed by Manischewitz, they were called Alsatian feathery balls. It's pretty funny. And another thing that some of you may have grown up with in soup are Crepe Luck, which are like more of a meat stuffed dumpling. I think I have a picture. They're fun to make, and you can use wonton wrappers as a shortcut. They're easy to make. This sign, which you can't really see, it's a sign that says, "I am driving slowly. I have a pot of soup with Crepe Luck." And this is funny because I made the soup for our Passover this year, which we had at a friend's, and Eddie and I went crazy trying to figure out how we're going to transport that big pot of soup. So, here's a picture of Crepe Luck, the little dumplings. They're usually filled with ground chicken or ground meat. And this quote, "One even gets bored of eating Crepe Luck," is actually a kind of backhanded thing that like Jewish men would say when they strayed, like if they had an affair. Yeah, it's a sort of classic Yiddish joke expression. So we make this in my class, and I believe that wonton soup was very familiar to Jews, so it's really, there it is, with some additions. A note about the Crepe Luck, the word for them in Ukrainian, sorry, that's a typo, is varenikis, which is where we get the word varnishkas, for kasha varnishkas. So originally kasha was used as a filling for the Crepe Luck. So the bow tie pasta was a shortcut that came later, and that really came later when American Jews lived in the same neighborhoods in the Bronx and in Brooklyn with Italian people. So my mother used to call those, this is funny, she used to call bow tie pasta, she would call farfel. Did anybody grow up with that expression, right? Which is from the Italian farfalle. Yeah, yeah. But farfel sounds more Jewish, that's for sure. And I just want to mention Romania before we move on to the Sephardic people. Romania has never been a good place for Jews to live, never. One of the most anti-Semitic places in the world. There have been Jews there since antiquity, but the population, increased in the 1850s, but there's always been anti-Semitism and pogroms and anti-citizenship initiatives since Jews arrived there. And there are very few Romanian Jews left in Romania. They were decimated in World War II, that community. But there were almost 1 million before World War II. So a lot of Romanian Jews, a lot of Americans who are descendants of Romanian Jews. They have a national dish, though, which this is really, really interesting. You can immediately tell if someone is from a Romanian Jewish household if you are served this in their home. Mamaliga. I mean, it's polenta, people. It's the same thing. There's a quote there from the famous song, Romania, Romania, a Yiddish song. To live there is a pleasure, whatever your heart desires there. From the Yiddish song, Romania, Romania. So it's an interesting food to me in terms of its journey because, you know, it's polenta and corn is a New World food. So this is a food that wandered with merchants and travelers back and forth. You know, it's polenta, what can I say? There's no difference. So now we're going to arrive in sunny Spain to meet the foodways of the other major branch of Jewry, the Sephardi. So Sephardim, I'll first say this is a map of the Sephardic migration. So you notice that it goes in the other direction, right? So the Ashkenazi one comes to the Americas and to Canada, and the Sephardim, who are from the Iberian Peninsula, both Spain and Portugal, they go east. And all the red dots are places where Sephardic Jews settled. Now, most of these Jews up and left to Israel. There are more Sephardic Jews in Israel, not more than there are Ashkenazi, but there are quite a few in Israel. And the reason is because they had to leave these places, because their populations were decimated in World War II. So a few things. The name simply means Spanish Jew or of the Iberian Peninsula in Hebrew. Their language is Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. It's a form of medieval Spanish. It's fascinating to linguists because it's frozen in time. And it is still spoken. Our son went to school in Bosnia, which is a place where many Sephardic Jews settled. Sarajevo was a huge population center for Jews before the war. And the town he lived in, there were maybe 3 Jewish families, and they invited the few Jewish kids from the school that he went to there for Shabbat dinner one night, and he said there was no common language at the table. Yeah. No, you know, no Bosnian. They spoke Ladino at the table, no Hebrew. So that's interesting. They populated both Spain and Portugal in huge numbers until 1492, and 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and the Jews all had to leave. So the Alhambra decree, which happened a little later in Portugal, was all Jews must do one of these 3 things: convert to Catholicism and therefore be allowed to remain within the kingdom, to remain Jewish and be expelled by the stipulated deadline, or to be executed. So all 3 things of those 3 things happened, but a lot left, as would I have, I imagine, if I were given those 3 choices. So this was a huge diaspora, created large Jewish communities in some unexpected places, but not so much America. I grew up in a very Jewish town in New Jersey, like South Orange, New Jersey. There were a lot of Jews. And of all my friends, I only knew one who was from a Sephardic family. And I only knew she was from a Sephardic family because, for one thing, her last name was Costa. And for another thing, my parents, when they met her, they were like, Costa, she's a Sephardi. So what do you eat? So interested. But some of the big places they went to the Balkans, they went to Greece, Thessaloniki, the city of Salonika. Before World War II, there were 60,000 Sephardic Jews in Thessaloniki. It was a huge, huge Jewish population called the Mother of Israel. These are other places. The Jewish population, the thriving Jewish population in the Balkans was decimated by over 90% by Nazis, Italians, and Croatians. Still a lot of Croatian anti-Semitism in the Balkans. But these are the places they went. And you know, if you can prove that you're a Sephardic Jew, you can get a Spanish passport now. So they've issued a right of return. The problem is a lot of Sephardic Jews just don't know they're Sephardic Jews. They don't know. It's hard, or you have no way to prove it. I mean, I suppose if you had a very Spanish last name like Costa, maybe that would be enough, but I don't know. This is interesting. So there was a migration of Sephardic Jews to England via Amsterdam. And if any of you have read the book, The Weight of Ink, it is about this migration, and I recommend it.
My favorite book.
Yes, okay, so that's about this migration. So there were early communities of Jews in England until, Ashkenazi Jews, until they were expelled in 1290. They were merchants and traders, they faced persecution. So Shakespeare would never have met a Jew in writing the character of Shylock and Jessica. There were none in England, they had been expelled. But in 1650, a Sephardic rabbi in Amsterdam approached Oliver Cromwell and asked that the Jews be readmitted, and he agreed. So he led a small congregation of Sephardic people who had settled in Amsterdam to the east end of London. That's what that book, The Weight of Ink, is about. They kept a very low profile because of fear of anti-Semitism, which certainly existed. And one way they did that was to adapt to Christian dietary customs. So this is a way where food could catch you out. So no meat on Fridays, fish on Fridays, big Christian dietary custom. So Jews took this on and pretty much are credited with creating the most ubiquitous, although now it's chicken tikka masala, but what we think of as perhaps the most iconic English food, which is fish and chips. Jewish food, 100%. It came to London with Portuguese Moranos, who were people who converted but still practiced in secret. It was a Shabbos dish, fried in oil on Friday to be served cold on Saturday. Fish is parva, it's neither milk nor meat. It's very useful food that way in Jewish culture. Obviously, if you came from Spain or Portugal, you used a lot of fish in your diet. Thomas Jefferson's writings indicate that he enjoyed tasting a dish in London he called fish fried in the Jewish manner. So we have some proof. It was most likely served with a sweet and sour dipping sauce or just lemon. The chips came later, attributed to an Ashkenazi shop owner. So fish and chips, Jewish food, who knew? Food could betray you. One of the ways in which the Spanish Inquisition would root out Jews was by looking at their food purchases. So they learned to mimic non-kosher dishes like ham. This is a cured goose ham to sort of hide their dietary predilections or religious things. So this is another very distinctive recipe of the Sephardim. It's called huevos haminados, which tells us it's baked eggs, but it tells us most likely it was part of the hamin, or their version of cholent. So these are eggs that are cooked for as long as overnight. They crack the shells and then put tea leaves and coffee in the water. So you end up with this beautiful thing. Chinese people do a similar thing. There's a similar dish in Chinese culture. And you can make them in a slow cooker. Anybody have any idea what an egg cooked overnight might taste like? It kind of does this reverse thing where it becomes very creamy. Like if you cook it long enough, it sort of goes back to this creamy state, and it is delicious. So you should try it. It's very easy. There's really no recipe. All right, we're going to talk about Italy. Italy is really interesting. The Jews of Italy they practice Sephardic rites, but they're really their own thing. They're their own category. They're both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, but they do mostly follow Sephardic religious rites. They're clustered primarily in the cities, or were, Rome, Venice, Florence, but also in smaller towns. They were craftspeople. They were very well assimilated into the culture. They have very distinctive foodways, especially the Jews of Rome. And the elements include a lot of vegetable dishes, sweet and sour flavors, and the use of raisins along with meats. Which is a Jewish thing, sweet and sour, the delight in sweet and sour taste. Like the Ashkenazi stuffed cabbage has raisins, rice and raisins in it, in the meat. So most of you know this, and from 1550 to 1870, a long time, the Jews of Rome lived in an area designated by papal law called the Quartiere, that looks like French, I don't know what it really is in Italian, Ebraico, but nicknamed the Ghetto, which was the Roman word for iron foundry, which is what was there before. So when we use the word ghetto to mean a place perhaps of poverty where one type of person lives, this is where it comes from. And there were a lot of rules of the ghetto. Jews were completely separate from Christians, separated by a wall. There could only be one synagogue. I mean, you know, I just said the Jews were very well assimilated in Italy, right? So, you know, it's sort of assimilated with an explanation, right? And there were times in history when they were more assimilated, but that period from the 1500s to the 1800s is a long period of time. When they left the ghetto, they had to be recognizable. Men were required to wear a large cone hat with bells. Women had to wear the same symbol that designated prostitutes. They couldn't fraternize with Christians, nor have any Christian servants. No Jew could be superior to Christians in any way. Of course, we know the story from The Merchant of Venice or The Jew of Malta. Those plays capture that reality. Only work they were free to do was rag trading, fishmongering, money lending, like Shylock, because that was, of course, useful to Christians because they couldn't do it. They were pawnbrokers. They couldn't work on Sunday, which was not their Sabbath. And they were required to attend church services. The earliest Jewish settlers actually were brought from the Roman victory in the First Jewish War and the destruction of the Second Temple. So we're talking about, you know, 66 to 73 Common Era. The Roman Empire controlled Judea, and they brought many thousands of Jewish slaves back to Rome. So that's where they think that community really started, is years and years of those slaves being freed and then having children. Large number were shipped to Puglia, the heel, and Calabria, the boot. Many bought their freedom. They were not good slaves, you know. They had to eat a certain way. They refused to work on Shabbat. You had to kill them. You know, they would rather die than work on Shabbat. So, they ultimately were able to buy their freedom, and they integrated in. These are just some of the places they lived. They became doctors. They became teachers. They had their own language, a Judeo-Italian, Italki. Ladino was also spoken. And by medieval times, the tax records indicate that there was a sizable number of Jews in southern Italy, and perhaps even greater in Sicily. Sort of important thing to remember about Italy is that until the mid-1800s, which is pretty late, Italy was not a united country, but it was a collection of nation states, kingdoms, and republics with distinct political structures and dialects and finances. The language we know as Italian was really the language of Rome and the language of Dante. Other people spoke very different versions of Italian throughout the boot. The reason Venice is called La Serenissima is because it's the Serene Republic of Venice. It had its own leadership. Same was true for all these other places. And the reason it's important as related to Jews is because each one of these republics had their own rules as related to their Jewish population. So things were very, very different depending on where you lived. Some places were much more open and friendly and integrated to Jews, other places not so much. There's a wealth of information found in medieval Italian art. And also Jewish businesses were taxed 5% by the government, so there's data regarding Jews in the tax rolls. So this is a very well documented community. So this is interesting. Unlike everywhere else in the world, Jewish last names were not distinctive in Italy. So you could be named Sakeli or your last name and be a Jew. There are exceptions. This slide is from my class. I show them this video. Interestingly, it's about an Italian-American rabbi named Barber Aiello, whose name most likely comes from the Hebrew Elal, which means upwards, skywards of God. So it is very likely that the actor Danny Aiello is actually a Jew. So it's kind of interesting. The most iconic Jewish Italian food. Jews were connected to vegetables, right? The stuff nobody wanted. So artichokes, what else? Eggplant, big Jewish Italian food. Leeks, I believe, were a big Jewish Italian food. This is an extremely difficult dish to make. I suggest you eat it in a restaurant, preferably in Rome or Venice. Carciofi alla Judia, it's the twice fried. I do have a video of someone frying it, but I won't show it because we don't have that much time. It's a twice fried artichoke that's been trimmed all the way down. It's fried in olive oil, actually, which is, a heavy oil. Absolutely delicious. I have this book over here. I'll just mention this wonderful woman, Edie Edda Macklin, who later emigrated to the United States after the Holocaust. She was from a town, Pitigliano in Tuscany, which had a large Jewish population, and she writes extensively on the Italian Jewish culture. And she has many recipes of interest in her cookbook, including this one, which is pretty interesting, tagliolini con la crosta, or Farros Wheel, which I think bears quite the resemblance to the torta that they make in the movie Big Night, right? It's a molded pasta dish. Yeah, it probably came from Jews because it cooked for a long time. That was part of the routine. But Jews, of course, would not make it with a sausage. They made it with salami. Tomato sauce, salami, raisins are ingredients in this. It's delicious. We make this in class. It's very easy. It's sort of just exactly what you would expect it is. The meat, the pasta, the tomato, the flavorings like the salami, the salty elements, and then the sweet elements, baked for a long time in a metal dish or casserole, and then flip it over and unmold it. Ultimately easy to make. Okay, talk a little bit about Mizrahi Jews, Eastern Jews, most from Persia, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. It also includes Jews from North Africa and the Caucasus, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, parts of Georgia. They lived side by side with Arabic people for generations, and the foods overlap. So many foods that we associate with Jewish people in Israel are really, you can't pull them apart from the Arab foodways that they came from. Falafel, for example, hummus, for example. If you're an Arab person, a person of Arab descent, you would say those are absolutely Arabic foods. No question, they are not Jewish foods. If you were a Jewish Israeli, you would say, no, those are iconic Jewish foods. Which makes the foodways of Israel controversial, actually, in some ways. Yes, so at times the cuisine of the Mizrahi Jews has been labeled appropriation because of things like hummus, falafel, kibbeh, etc. This is where they primarily live now. Food is delicious. It's the best food, really, I think. Vegetable forward, light, flavorful, and miles ahead of the Sephardic heavy food. The name, meaning Eastern Jews, we see that last name, like the designer Isaac Mizrahi. There would be no question that he would be a Jew. Another very common name is Sassoon. Those were sort of the Mizrahi families. The Sassoon families were families that name came passed down for generations. Iraqi Jews, extremely interesting cuisine. Babylon was the seat of Jewish learning, so really the heart of Judaism that's not Jerusalem was for many years Babylon, and it's where the Mishnah and the Talmud were written. A stable and good place for Jews until the rise of Islam, when there were persecutions. Stability returned under the Turks, and then it became impossible. And in 1951, Israel launched an operation, a specific operation to return Iraqi Jews to Israel. And from over 120,000 Jews in Iraq, none are left. None stayed. I mean, I don't even think there's a synagogue in the country. I have a few dishes to show you. This is a delicious dish, tabit, or tabit. It's a Shabbat dish of whole chicken stuffed with spiced rice on a bed of more rice, cooked very slowly. Rice is very associated with Persia and Iraq. Traditional dish of the Babylonian Jews, very ancient dish. It has the crispy rice layer, the tadig, and often used with this spice mix, baharat. There's a picture of it. Delicious. Again, it's got this connection to the cholent with the egg, the hamim. You were like pumping up the nutrition in this food. It had to last you a long time. The recipe that I make with my students, and that probably we eat once every couple of weeks, is this extremely, extremely delicious dish. It's called, I don't know how to pronounce this, and I'm sorry about that. I've just had a hard time finding the proper pronunciation. I actually need to find a North African person. It's a spicy Libyan fish stew called crème or crime, and it often has an A in the beginning, so it can be called akran. It's delicious, it's simple, it's a great use of summer tomatoes, and basically all you do is make a spicy tomato sauce like you would make for shakshuka, and then you just slide the fish in and cook it for 10 minutes. Delicious. I use cherry tomatoes, get them caramelized. Very good. So we're running out of time, and I do want to sort of get to this last group that is just extremely interesting. So I'm going to talk about a branch of Jewry that not a lot of people know about in this country. We refer to them as the Mountain Jews, or they refer to themselves as the Mountain Jews. And they're Jews of the Caucasus region. Basically, at some point when things got bad and the glass started breaking in the Mizrahi lands, Iraq, Iran, Syria, a group of Jews migrated north into the Caucasus. And one group sort of went this way into Georgia, and one group went this way into Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Dagestan. So they are descendants of Persian Jews, and they took shape as a community fairly late in the 1800s, although there had been Jews living there since prehistory. They are distinct in culture, the ones in the stands from the Jews of Georgia, and their foods are different. They believe they are descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Incidentally, the Jews of India believe the same thing. If we have time, I'll quickly go through India. They were known as soldiers and fierce fighters and horsemen, and perhaps were sent there by the Shah to guard the mountain passes. There's so many interesting things about them. For one thing, they're still there. So there's a town that was set up in Azerbaijan by the Soviets called the Red Town. That's it in Azerbaijani, which is an interesting language. Krasnaya Sloboda in Russian, which means Red Town. It is thought to be, there are still Jews there, like a lot of Jews there. It is thought to be the last remaining shtetl, basically, a town of only Jews. Other than in Israel, there's like one in the U.S. In the like New York region, the Albany region. So the Red Town was under protection of the Soviets in World War II, and that's how they survived World War II. That does not mean that the Soviets loved them and they had a very peaceful relationship with the Soviets. It was a disaster with the Soviets, but in World War II they were protected. Currently there are about 3,500, and many emigrated to bigger cities like Baku, and many immigrated to New York and Israel. And if you ever have the opportunity to eat Azerbaijani Jewish food, it is delicious. Also very Persian and feeling rice-based. But one of the more interesting things about them is that this town is filled with oligarchs, Jewish oligarchs. The main street are like mansions, huge mansions. These are Soviet Jews who were settled, are the descendants of the people who settled in this region, who guarded the mountain passes, exacted tolls, built wealth, and ultimately went into oil. These are oil-rich countries, trading, merchant life, and some of them, not all of them obviously, but some of them became very, very rich. So there's a remarkable number of Russian oligarchs who are actually mountain Jews, which is fascinating. They're kind of national dishes. We have rice again here, very easy to make. Plov is the Russian word we would use. Ush palau is more the word we would use known as palau, pilaf, coming from Persia. Very representative of the cooking of the Caucasus. It's all these ingredients. Tom Tove in the jewelry district in New York is a place you can eat it, but you can also make it very easily. It's like a stew with rice and lamb and all these things, very nutritious, very wholesome, very delicious. An interesting thing about it is that you can cook it on horseback. So it was these traders and soldiers would put it in an oiled bag, all the ingredients. They'd boil water and they'd pour it in. They'd seal it up. And they'd ride around on the horses. And when they got to where they were going, the heat of the animal and the boiling water would have cooked this dish. So that is not a way I have tried to make it, but I have heard that if you go to the home of someone from this region in New York, for example, Azerbaijani, they do make it sometimes sort of in a boiling bag method, in a big pot of boiling water, which is kind of interesting. Another interesting thing I'll just mention is that the delicious food that we know as the Chinese soup dumpling does occur in this cuisine, and the belief is that the sort of Mongolian people mingled down through the Caucasus and brought the soup dumpling. So, kind of interesting. We're almost out of time, and I want to be mindful of that. I do have a section here that I'll just mention that, of course, we're talking about Morocco and North Africa. These are Sephardic Jews that came from the Moorish places, Morocco and Spain, very close together. So there were migrations in both directions there. These are Sephardic people. They cook the foods that we associate with Moroccan food, tagine in the designated pot, the couscousière. You see that in Jewish food. Couscous, very, very labor intensive. There is a restaurant in New York called Kishkash where you can try handmade couscous. I actually don't know if it's still there. I should check. I do have a few tips for fluffy couscous. Anyway, oh, I have this in two places. I think we're sort of out of time. I will mention this. It's very interesting. There's actually an interesting story. So there's a Yemeni. There are Yemeni Jews. There were Jews in Yemen since the time of King Solomon. Completely isolated from other Jewish communities in the world. They were discovered in 1901 by a German Jewish ethnographer. These were pictures that he took of the people he found in Yemen. It really took the Jewish community worldwide by storm that there were brethren in this part of the world. And there are no Jews left in Yemen. They went to Israel. But one really interesting food that I'll just mention, because it has a connection to foods that we eat all the time, it's called Kubana. It's a Shabbat bread, and I believe that it's the origin of the kind of pastry we refer to as viennoiserie, you know, the croissant. That those people would have traveled and mingled to Vienna, and they would have brought this laminated pastry, because it's sort of the original version of a laminated pastry. You roll out the dough very thin, you smear it with oil. They would have used oil, you could use butter. You could use, the time I tasted it, it was actually made with margarine, which is of course an evil food, but it was delicious. It's rolled up and then rolled again and baked into a pull-apart bread that is got the texture of a croissant inside. It was be baked in a pot and overnight, and which is it's just fascinating to me that this food that's Yemeni sort of is the technique that is used in French and Viennese pastry making. So fascinating. I do have a section on the Jews of India, which are amazing, but there's not much time. And the foods of Israel. I'll just stop by posing that question. Can you call a homeland a diasporic nation? I think it depends on who you are. If you're a Jew or if you're not a Jew. Israel is, of course, very controversial, and I won't get into that, but I would say some of the best food in the world can be found in Israel now, because it's all there, right? The best of everything. Things grow in the desert. The tomatoes, the cucumbers, the onions, it's got the influence of every Jew, you know, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardim, the North Africans, they all brought their culture there and their food there. So you certainly can eat very well. And of course the national dish the Jews love is shakshuka, although I don't like it. Because I don't like the loose eggs. So we never have it. But very easy to make, and it of course answers the question, can we get away with just eggs for dinner today? Yes, we can. So that's it for, you know, that we have time for. It's a lot of material. There's at least 20 recipes that are kind of the figurative ones, and I will put them together in a packet and send it to Renee. Yes, Renee, right? But I could take a few questions. Are there any? Or if anyone wants to share what they grew up with or anything that's in it. Yeah?
Well, I just read a story about Meyer Lansky, of all people.
Yeah.
When he was a young boy, he had 5 cents, he was on his way to pay the communal baker on the Lower East Side to cook
The cholent, yeah.
And he came upon a crap game and he got fascinated. And he didn't wind up paying the baker, and his mother was just totally devastated because they didn't have
food. That's a good one. Any questions or thoughts or?
How did you get all these recipes?
Well, I actually brought a collection of my cookbooks over there, some of the more interesting ones. I like to collect Jewish cookbooks and other cookbooks as well. One of the ones is an extraordinary source is Claudia Rodin's The Book of Jewish Food, and I think that's the one that really everyone should have if you're going to have one. It really takes you around the world and teaches you about all the different cultures. And then and the recipes are very simple, really quite simple. So actually almost too simple for our, it's like you look at them, there's 4 ingredients and you think, is this really going to be good? But that's a great one. There's a young couple who wrote this book, The Gefilte Manifesto. That's their whole thing is like rediscovering Ashkenazi food, and they have some really interesting recipes, like for drinks, like how to make your own celery tonic, and like these funny, iconic Jewish foods. A lot of pickles, a lot of krauts, and I now make my kasha varnishkas their technique, which is they vegetable it up. So they put a lot of mushrooms and thinly sliced Brussels sprouts that they then caramelize with onion, and then they bake it twice. So they cook it and mix it, then put it in a baking pan, it gets crispy on top. So I love that one. So, it's searching. There's Tablet Magazine online. It's a Jewish magazine that has a big food section. Joan Nathan is, of course, the goddess of American Jewish cooking, and you can't, and not just American, her research is impeccable, her recipes always work. And you can find a lot of those in Tablet Magazine, which you can subscribe to for free, and learn all sorts of crazy things about, When Eddie and I used to go visit my parents in Florida, we used to go to this bookstore, and it had this book that we used to laugh at that was called Guess Who's Jewish? You'll Never Guess. Sometimes it was like, it would have like Woody Allen. It's like, really? But it used to have, and you read Tablet Magazine, you sort of have that reaction, like, wow, I didn't know that person was Jewish. But, so those are some places, for sure. I encourage you to branch out of the, sort of Ashkenazi reality that we've all sort of grew up with, because some of the Sephardic foods and the North African foods, are just so light and so delicious, and just worth eating. So yeah, those are just some places.
Yeah, can I mention something?
Yes.
I just want to mention that, Stanley Tucci, you mentioned him with Big Night. Also, he has an incredible show about the cuisine of Italy that you can see, I think, on Netflix now.
Yeah.
And he has a section in that, or an episode of that show on the Jewish food of Italy that has like those artichokes being made, and it's just incredible. So.
I'm a little intimidated by artichokes, not just by boiling an artichoke and peeling it off. That's fine, but when you watch these people who make these in a restaurant, it's like they do it like so fast. They pull the things off, and then it's quite extraordinary how they do it. I have a little bit of fear of deep frying, so it's not a thing I do, but I would eat it in a restaurant for sure. It's interesting to do this with young students, with college-age students, because you have to teach them how to slice an onion, it's remarkable how many young people, none of our children, of course, grow up not knowing their way around a kitchen. And so it's sort of, the courses become twofold, it's become exploring. And each one of these, cuisines and worlds I talked about is like an entire week of the class, right? So we spend a bunch of time on them, and there's sort of individual talks and lectures, and then every other week we're in the kitchen. So it's become both about like exploring the culture and their own culture, and exploring, learning how to cook. So, yeah.
I don't know if it's available online, it was a long time ago, but I once saw this charming little documentary that a young woman made about gefilte fish, which is, it's made with fish that's flaked, and it showed her grandmother with the fish
in the bathtub,
and her mother with the Cuisinart.
Right.
With the Cuisinart, and then she opened up a jar and put it in the fish.
Right.
It was very cute to show how Americans simplify.
Yeah, and actually I'll show you this, the real way to make gefilte fish, which is in this cookbook. It means stuffed fish, as we know. The actual way to make it is to stuff a fish in its own skin and then poach it. Very hard, I think. It takes a long time. Complicated. But we all grew up with the quenelles, sort of the little. Yeah.
That looks better than
It does a little. They also have a recipe for it in a loaf pan, which actually isn't bad. It is delicious, I think, especially with the horseradish sauce. But maybe you have to be Jewish. But yeah, these people are. I give them a lot of credit. They have this real devotion to these old food ways, and they teach you how to make your own farmer's cheese and your own pickles, and many of the raw ingredients are fun to look at. There's an adorable picture of them in here, but I'm not finding it. But it's heartening to know that young people are pursuing this food. So yeah.
So you mentioned frying. I think making latkes is the only time I ever fry.
Me too.
Are people all over the world still making some of those foods, but making them in a different way so they don't have to like deep fry?
Well,
Are there any like sort of new traditions of?
You know, I think there's always new traditions, and people figure out ways to make things with less oil. And, you know, I mean, of course, the sort of irony of deep frying is that if you really get the oil the right temperature and you cook it fast and deep fry it, you may actually be consuming less oil than if it sits in a pan with that much oil, right? So I do know Italian culture is still, the Roman culture is very deep frying, a lot of deep fried foods.
My grandmother fried everything.
Yeah, for sure. But you know, for me, it feels like a mess, and it feels unhealthy, and you know, but it's in some ways the perfect way to cook, right? Because you're cooking the food from all angles at once. So, but yeah, I do think. I mean, people are certainly aware of you know, being healthier and making healthier choices, and
This is such a project.
it is a project, and the latkes are a project, and you know, they really don't work unless you use a lot of oil. Yeah, the you know, Israeli Jews for Hanukkah make it's like sufaniyot, right? The what would you call them? They're donuts. They're jelly donuts. So that's another common deep fried Jewish food, but it sort of became popular in Israel, not so much
Don't
here.
bother air frying latkes.
Yeah.
I somebody bought an air, was one of those people who bought an air fryer. He was like, we'll just air fry them. I'm like, no, it's not gonna, and it was.
It doesn't work,
No,
yeah.
Don't do that.
That's true. I would not do that. You eat them once a year, and you use absolutely as much oil as you possibly can. And you have a brisket on the side. Oh, I wish I could find this funny picture of them. It's a great cuisine. God knows we've shared a lot of it with other people, right? Like, you know, so much of it has become American cuisine. Here's a picture of this cute young couple who, there's a picture of them, I think, grating horseradish later in the book, and they have the goggles down over there.
Why do you think you never see peanuts or stir frying?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think ground nuts, maybe you would see them maybe in North African cuisine a bit,
Yeah.
but certainly not in Ashkenazi. I mean, they just didn't grow.
Right,
So
right.
yeah. Although interestingly, like you know, major food in Israel for children is that peanut. It's like peanut butter that's been sort of blown up with air. It's like a Cheeto. Yeah, with bamba. It's called bamba. It's like all Israeli children grow up on bamba. So the peanut flavor sort of has been adapted in that way. But yeah, you don't see that. And is there anything that you would call a Jewish food that would really be stir fry?
I mean, I guess frying is their way to cook something fast.
Yeah. And of course, you know, there's always that question, like, why do Jews love Chinese food so much? And I think part of it is because many Jews who grew up in a kosher household, the rules were relaxed for eating out, right? So you would go to a restaurant that was inexpensive and filling, and you got to eat pork, you got to eat shrimp, right? So, I mean, that was definitely the Jewish Chinese food affinity. So, you know, we certainly eat a lot of stir fries in our house. It's like a major...
I don't know, my college boyfriend was a New York Jew, and he said it was because Chinese restaurants were open.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
on
yeah.
Christmas, they'd be
Yeah.
open.
Well, I think
Or
that's...
on,
I think
you know,
that's
on
true.
A lot of, some of the other holidays, they'd be open.
Yes, I think that's true, but I grew up in a New York Jewish family that basically had to eat Chinese food twice a week. And I actually, I'm a good cook, and the only food I tend to eat out is Asian food. And I like crave it, you know. Yeah,
Were there any Asian Jews, like Chinese Jews?
yes, yes. Shanghai had a Chinese Jewish population. A lot of the Sassoon family made their money in Shanghai, actually. So there were migratory Jews in China.
No, I had a Chinese brother.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. So I mean, we really are truly everywhere. So yes, in China and India, 3 big communities, which is interesting, with their own kind of foodways and a lot of coconut, a lot of fish, a lot of tomato, a lot of very vegetable forward, delicious food. In Goa is one of the big Jewish communities. A lot of those people have gone to Israel now. They're smaller, those communities, and the Chinese community, I think, is tiny. I have this friend who's from South Dakota, non-Jewish, and I used to joke with her that her people settled the prairie and my people came along with push carts and sold them stuff. Because, Jews, we could be merchants. We were really good at that piece. And, one of the reasons we were good at that piece was because of Yiddish. Because you'd go anywhere and you could sell somebody something because you spoke the same language as them. So it became a business you could do. And if you couldn't own land, and you couldn't afford to go to medical school, which you could do in the medieval times as a Jew, theoretically, you could sell stuff because people spoke your language. The Yiddish is the key in many ways for the Ashkenazi. Yiddish is the key to the ability to move and travel and make a home anywhere.
Wait, people other than Jewish people spoke?
No.
No, but all the Jews.
All the ones who got
Yes,
them.
right, the ones you were going to sell. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, other people didn't. But you know what? Other people spoke German. So, you could manage. My father took German in college, and anytime he did a speech or had to speak in class, the teacher would listen, and then at the end he would say, "Excellent Yiddish, Mr. Sakala." Never could quite get the German. But, a lot of words, most days, it's 80% German, so you could manage. Yeah.
The German Jews that were really came before the Eastern European Jews in the 19th century.
Came here.
Came here.
Yeah.
Did they have dishes that were?
They did. The things that were made with, the thing we get from that culture is sauerkraut. I mean, preserving cabbage was the thing Jews did. It's the thing everybody did. But the Alsatian kind of sauerkrauty meats, goose, those things, I think were very much part of that cuisine. And I would say the latke comes out of that cuisine as much as there's a French version, that's like the big latke. I would say that to some degree comes out of that cuisine, but they're pretty blended together, all of that. They all influenced each other. The German Jews from big cities had a more, perhaps were more assimilated, so ate more of the foods other than the kosher laws that Christian people would eat, I think. Some of those things are very interesting to me, like the connection to the poultry industry is really interesting to me. In France, Jo Nathan has a book about the food of France, the Jewish France, and she talks a lot about that poultry industry being a place where Jews worked. The foie gras industry was many Jews force-fed piece to make foie gras that was not really eaten by Jews, although I imagine they did to some degree, but destined for high-class kitchens. So, thank you.
Thank you.
It's a lot. Too much info.